It's about history. It's about preservation. It's about sense of place here on Eastern Long Island. With Esperanza Leon, I'm Irwin Levy, and this is Our Hamptons. Esperanza, good morning.
Hello, Irwin.
Wow. Now, Esperanza, normally we have a lot of, dare I call it happy banter in the morning, when we start these podcasts. We always try to, even when we have a somber subject, a meaty subject, to use Esperanza's term, we try to have a little levity. But I will tell you, it is a little challenging with today's subject matter and today's guest, Esperanza.
It's true. It's true. Although, and if I might, I'm so happy to introduce Mark Torres into this conversation. But Mark is a person who I know has a sense of humor, but he's writing about some fairly heavy topics, and we're gonna dive into one of those today.
Exactly right. And that was another excellent segue. Esperanza, over 80 some odd podcasts. I'm used to your segues, so thank you for that one as well. But without further ado, I won't, Mark, in my Queen's accent, I'm not going to be able to roll those R's the way Esperanza did. But Mark Torres, labor lawyer, prolific writer. We're going to get into all of Mark's books, but the one we're really focusing on today is Long Island Migrant Labor Camps. Mark Torres, welcome to Our Hamptons podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's an honor to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you. Now, Mark, I guess we really just want to give our audience a little bit of a brief personal background. Your background is as a labor lawyer, and the subject we're going to cover really dialogues well with that. Was your work as a labor lawyer, was that one of your incentives to start writing, exploring, researching this subject, or did the research come before you actually started practicing law?
Well, I could say certainly as a labor lawyer, and I do represent a Teamsters union. We have just almost 4,000 members, and they're sole attorneys. So it's an honor and a privilege to be in that role.
Right.
And I've always prided myself in looking for topics that cover labor. It's an important matter. It's not just the workforce, but it's the human element and people involved. And as you mentioned, I'm also an author, historian, and I'm a professor of labor studies at Hofstra University. And that's always just a great honor. So I would say it's kind of in tandem with my interest and normal inclination to cover labor history, and then also learning of this topic, which was quite traumatic.
Terrific. And Esperanza, I do have to interject one thing. Mark's from Queens, Anyway.
Yes,
Mark, we can't help it.
So I heard. It's become the Our Queens podcast.
It is,
ladies and gentlemen.
Because these guys from Queens, Esperanza, they're real, and like
scrappy.
We go where the stories take us.
Exactly.
That's right.
Exactly.
That's right.
So Mark, and again, we want to keep the story as local as possible, as this is Our Hamptons podcast, but just to really give a little bit of a background, with the 1935 National Labor Relations Act, this was not for farm workers, because what we're going to get into what these labor camps and everything was, but that act did not specify farm workers, protecting them. Are we correct in that assumption?
Yes. In fact, it specifically excluded farm workers, and it still does specifically exclude farm workers. It was sort of the deal cut between FDR, Roosevelt, and with his New Deal program and the agriculturalists, where basically the farm workers of the nation were essentially thrown out of the lifeboat, and it was a tragic result, which really led to much of what we've seen studying this history, the dark consequences.
Wow.
So you're saying that this law actually it has extended into today? I mean, does it continue to exist, or in a different shape or a different form?
Yeah, well, essentially, there are no federal labor law protections for farm workers throughout the country. It's really up to the states. Now, ironically, in California, in the early mid-1970s, thanks to Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, there was change there. But New York did not adopt a labor law in New York State for farm workers until 2020. Effective 2021. Wow. So it's quite tragic.
All right, here's where we're starting to get into, Esperanza, did you hear the sigh? That was the heavy sigh coming, right? But look, the root cause of so many issues, conflicts, problems, and Esperanza and I have talked about this. Everything tends to be very often racially motivated. The racism, and part of what we're going to go to when we start getting into really, and I think we're going to start heading there now, are these Long Island migrant labor camps. I mean, Mark, your book is titled incredibly. Perhaps I'm going to ask you, tell our audience what it is. What's the definition of a Long Island migrant labor camp, and when did these really start out here? I'm going to just to give our audience a little framework before we delve deeper.
Sure. Well, the term labor camp itself was used interchangeably. It couldn't really have meant anything and did mean anything from a rundown shack, a barn, a small cabin, a large cinder block building. It really ran the gamut. In fact, even in Greenport, there was a historic mansion that was used as a labor camp, and really just kind of ran the gamut. The first camp was actually in 1943, and I say the first camp under New York law, because New York State was appointed. Two counties were appointed to begin using labor camps, and one of them was Suffolk County, the other up in Niagara County, upstate. And the first camp was in Peconic. It was called Lake Lodge, a three-story home, really summer beach cottage, was used as a labor camp for the workers. And the book goes beyond just the identifying the camps. I thought, as I still do, it's really a people story. So the importance of the book was to capture the impact on the camp's inhabitants, which included human suffering, economic exploitation, but also the effects on the economy, community, and first responders. It also touched on outspoken critics of the system, which I'll get to later, and it explained what the factors that led to the decline of the camps. But starting in 1943, and then three other camps opening up at that point, was really the crux of this really modern history.
Yeah. Now,
and
good,
so
I'm sorry,
sorry,
Esperanza.
Irwin. I just want to say something. So, I mean, in a way, when you say this came out of the state, you would think this would have been regulated in some way. So there would have been more oversight. So there would have been more care for the humans that were going to inhabit these places. But as it turns out, that's completely the opposite.
Well, initially, and Esperanza, you're touching on an important point. Thank you. Initially, the first four camps, and presumably because there were only four camps, they were sponsored by the U.S. government. And that was to the delight of the farmers who didn't have to spend out of pocket. The workers came from the island of Jamaica. It was $100 a man to bring them to these camps. And because there was more oversight and less camps, there was an ability to kind of suggest that these camps were fairly decent. But
Uh-huh.
once the wartime program ended in 1947 and the camps began in mass, and then it became the brutal profit-driven system that really led the way here, and that's where the problems really came from.
It's so interesting, just as an aside. I mean, this was a matter of national security because you're saying wartime, and this was a way to keep the agricultural industry going and keep the country in motion while men and women, but men in particular, were away fighting the war.
That's right.
Correct?
That's right. In 1960, Edward R. Murrow released a documentary called Harvest of Shame, which is available widely on YouTube.
It's
And
excellent. Yeah.
he published and promoted that film on Thanksgiving Day to shame the nation on how we treat our farm workers. And you're absolutely right, Esperanza. I mean, we're presumably the most well-fed nation on earth, but look how the workers who produce that outcome are
Right.
treated and still are
Right.
treated. And that's the problem.
And now from what I've read, and I read most of the book. I didn't finish it. It's I was saying to Mark Esperanza before we even went on the air for a couple of minutes how like really the book makes you angry reading about it, but just how these people were treated. And again, now Mark, correct me if I'm wrong, but at its peak, we had 7,000 migrant workers on Long Island, approximately. Am I correct in that, Matt?
Yes, that's a rough estimate, but
Right.
close to accurate.
Right. And again, just to give, and I got this from your book, just to give a little bit of the trajectory, Esperanza, in 1951, there were 29 registered camps. By 1958, there were 134 registered camps, according to Mark Torres' book, again, Long Island Migrant Labor Camps. So,
Right. Right. And this, by the way, coincides obviously with the sort of the rise of the potato. I mean, there were other crops, obviously, but really, Mark, correct me if I'm wrong, was this mostly, I mean, it's a little bit of everything, but was it mostly tied with
Oh,
the potato?
You are correct. Potato was king. In fact, in 1949, there were between 14 and 18 million bushels of potatoes produced in Suffolk County. And remember, we're just talking Suffolk County and just registered camps. They likely could have been unregistered camps, but this is only within the parameters and the regional area of Suffolk County.
Right.
Right. Unregistered camps, but also just people living in, as you've indicated, I mean, something like a chicken coop on a farm
Literally,
or something like that.
I mean, the housing, again, we really want to bring this across to our audience, Esperanza, the housing that Mark talks about. And we're going to delve into this specifically in a couple of minutes. But for a brief overview, shacks, sheds, chicken coops. I mean, chicken coops, sheds. This is where people were living. And Mark used a term, I guess it was the term of its time. Riverhead to Greenport was called Migrant Alley. Yeah. I mean, really. And
Irwin, to add on that, even former duck buildings that we used to house the ducks from Long Island's booming duck industry were converted to really rent with no running water, terrible smells and odors and insects, and they were renting them to migrants to live in these facilities. With terrible consequences.
It's unbelievable. I think we're gonna touch on, and this was chapter 3 in Mark's book, and this is really the part of the book where I really started. Oh my goodness.
You had to put it down for a moment.
I had to walk away for a minute because it was just really getting me.
It is tough.
It's tough reading, not tough reading in the sense that, wow, I mean, how are people being treated like this? But,
it's eye-opening, really.
It is eye-opening. And we talk about racial motivation. And now the farmers, obviously at this time, and Mark alluded to the fact that many of these people were from Jamaica. They, down the road later on, they were actually recruited. We're going to get into this a little bit deeper in a few minutes, but they went to the poorer, more economically depressed states to actually recruit these people. And they were predominantly, again, the Jamaicans, African Americans, what have you. Now, before we get into how the farms and the camps themselves, Mark, the residents of these community, they really didn't want these people they literally didn't want them on their beaches. They didn't want their children in their schools. Am I correct?
That is correct, Erwin. There was a large amount of racial animus. In fact, prior to establishing a labor camp in the town, the townships, in particular Southold and others in Southampton, would have to approve through public referendum the use of these camps. Now, initially there was pushback, and it was really voted down negatively, largely because of racial animus. But we have to remember this was an agricultural industry in an agricultural setting. And sooner or later, those needs, took over, and any outrage or protests quickly dissipated to the needs of the industry, and then eventually the camps began to open up.
I'm so glad, Esperanza, that Mark just said that. Now, one of our missions on Our Hamptons is always we try to transport our audience to a time and a place. Now, remember, we are talking really predominantly here, about the heart of it, I guess, was really the 1950s when we're really going to talk about. And if Eastern Long Island, and forget the South Fork, which was also we've gone over this, I mean, was a fishing and farming community. My goodness, the North Fork was even more so a fishing and farming community.
Yeah, no, both. I mean, both. And I would say one thing is that, you get this illusion nowadays of the Hamptons and how this was always this very prosperous. Yes, the people were always going to live because there was the fishing and farming. They would live decent lives. But this was a very impoverished place in the 1950s for everybody. Yeah. For everybody.
Esperanza,
farmers, fishermen, everybody.
This was
not the Hamptons in that sense of luxury.
We would speak of the bookends, right? East Hampton Village, Southampton Village, but the things in between were, to your point, completely different. But, Mark, getting back again, trying to bring this a little really more local to the East End at this point. In that chapter 3, there was a quote from George Seltzer, who, and Mark, you'll explain who he specifically was. His title was the Eastern Suffolk Cooperative President. But Esperanza, he said this, I wrote this quote down because it just really hit home. He said this to Helen Wright Prince, who was a teacher that was employed to teach the children of the migrant workers. And George Seltzer, and this is a quote from Mark's book, Helen, you don't have to teach them. Just keep them in order. Mark, I'll leave it to you to elaborate.
Yeah, thank you, Irwin. There's not much to really extrapolate from that. And that callous indifference really was what led the day here. George was an interesting character. He was the lead trustee at the time of the Eastern Suffolk Cooperative, which ran two camps, essentially the Cutchaw camp, which was the largest in not only Long Island, but New York State, the capacity of up to 300 workers at any given time, but also the Greenport labor camp over where the current San Simeon is in on County Road 48. Yeah, that kind of indifference. And Helen and I read through Helen's notes, and she's a noted town historian and recognized for her stellar work. You know, she lobbied continuously for more funds. And the class, the school itself was really it was one room. There was a pipe of leaky sewage, terrible odors, not optimal prime conditions for learning, but it was something. And Helen also continuously lobbied for more money for pencils and stationery and all of these things that the basics your student would need to continue on. And you know that kind of indifference really was ruled the day, and it's kind of a sad indictment of what it was to become.
Yeah, and keep in mind, I mean, this was a way, not only, were children, because these were families that were moving here and working in this industry, and parents would be out in the fields, children would be otherwise left at home untended. So this was also a way for keeping, not only educating, but keeping them safe in a way under supervision.
Yeah, and that's Ron, to your point. It brings me back to 1950, and this was right, obviously, in Bridgehampton. A family of 11 was living in a 14 by 18-foot rundown shack in Bridgehampton, between Bridgehampton and Sag Harbor Road, about a half a mile from the village of Bridgehampton. October 22nd, 1950. A fire erupted. Everyone escaped except the two youngest, Katie Lou Jenkins, 3 years old, and Walter Jenkins, 1 year old, who was sleeping furthest away from the exit. What happened in the wake of the deaths of those two children, was that the community realized that this is a problem. We have to safeguard the children. And what that actually led to the formation of the Bridgehampton Child Care and Recreational Center, which then and still does provide meals for children, for the parents. New York State subsidized it, but also volunteers out. They had fundraisers. They had beach events, art on the dunes, and toy drives and music festivals. It was one of the rare beacons of positivity that I found in this work, where a community realized this is a tremendous problem and has to really, there's got to be some remedy for it.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah, and that it is a marvelous place, and to think that it does go back to mid-century, mid 20th century. That's how long it has been functioning, and as you point out, I mean, it's just such a resource for the community.
Yeah. Esperanza, I agree with you and with what Mark said, and I want to thank Mark for that. We all know about that. The Bridgehampton Childcare has a relatively high profile, in the community today for what it's doing. I didn't realize that was really the origin of it, and I mean
And I'll tell you,
it
and
was
to add to
another
that,
eye opener.
it was, and no, they actually contacted me because they struggled, and this is part of the problem from the inception, right? They struggle with their own origins in identifying the names of the children, the actual incidents. I did a little more research on it and filled them in. It was a great honor to do so, but it tells a bigger story. The suppression of this history. When I learned of this, the more I learned, the greater my obligation grew to tell the story. And I was genuinely stunned that no one has written about it. And
Mm.
to date, this is the only book to cover this history in a comprehensive manner. And it really, really, you're trying to pinpoint the whys and the hows. But obviously, farming communities, not a good history. Whether it was purposeful or just through neglect, just let this history kind of go unnoticed. And that's why it became my mission to tell the story. And it was a great honor to do so.
Well, we're grateful. It's almost hard to believe listening to that, Esperanza, how wasn't for Mark, the story would remain sort of really way off radar. And it's just,
Yeah,
it's
because
really,
I mean, I know, Mark, that you did consult sources from the newspapers, for instance, but I mean, it's very difficult to track these stories because these people, it was like they were invisible. But there were people writing about these camps, not from very early on, but would you say from the 1960s? I mean, I don't know. It's
Yeah, definitely. I credit reporters, even Steve Wick, who's a local reporter and author,
yes.
more contemporary, but certainly, and also the outspoken critics of the time, who I term in the book as better angels. I think of Arthur Bryant, a Lutheran or minister who was a strong advocate for the workers. He testified at Congress. He spoke on radio and television programs. And for all his efforts, he received death threats.
Hmm.
Um, so many others who really stepped up at the time and did what they could to help along the way. Um, Mary Chase Stone, a wealthy woman from New England area, let go of all her fortunes, resettled in Riverhead, and really opened up like sort of a halfway home that could help these workers and also train them on new occupations to leave this migrant stream of labor and help them find new ways. So,
You,
it was really important. And again, some beacons of hope, this, amidst the sea of sorrow, it was helpful to see some of those good examples of fighting the good fight.
Right.
and
Sorry, I get so into this subject because you made me think, Mark, of it's sort of this vicious cycle of these men in particular who would enter this world and never be able to improve their lives because, and you can explain this better, I think, of how they were paid, how they were really extorted. I mean, it was not a fair life, and they would never be able to save any kind of money and to get out and improve their lives.
yeah,
Yeah, no, it was led by this what was called the crew leader system. So you would have um, largely African American men who would go back to their home states, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, and they would go to these local bars and places where young men typically would congregate, and they would promise them with these allures of working up on Long Island and making this money and doing everything well. And they were already in a economically depressed area, so they felt with little option, they joined on. The minute they stepped on the bus, they're on the hook for the enormous transportation fees. And then when they get to the camps, they're really without money. Everything was laid forward on credit, and all the money was deducted from their pay. And then there were cuts in pay if there were work stoppages. They had to wait around. There was retaliation if the crew leaders didn't favor one worker or another. He would keep them there, not working for the day, but still incurring the cost of daily living at the camp. So if workers broke even at the end of the season, they were lucky, but most of the times they weren't. And it was just a chronic economic exploitation and really brutal control of a pool of labor for many years.
that's part of the you mentioned one in particular, and Andrew Anderson, who was really notorious for this. But yeah, I mean, like to paint this picture as Mark just did, they promised them a bed of roses, and they charged them, and not just charged them for transportation. An enormous fee. They was
Overcharged them, yeah.
overcharged them. Every price was inflated for
And
meals,
for
for
and for
drinks,
food,
for
exactly. Yes,
food,
yes.
for lot for their
Supplies. Hmm.
for their lives. And to Mark's point, and it was all done like on credit. And again, these people were taken advantage of. They were not sophisticated in what was being done to them, and it was it was extortion. I mean, really extortion. It was
Truly,
almost
truly.
mob-like behavior, really.
Yeah.
Well, and
What
it
was
was preying on the innocent in a
yes.
way because I think, Mark, you bring up the story of Alfonso Mahon, who was just 15, and please, share that story because this was the kind of really, I mean, it was like a trap for these people.
Sure. Alfonso Mahone, a 15-year-old boy from Macon, Georgia, essentially was trafficked, exploited, cheated out of wages. Winded up in Bridgehampton and worked at two labor camps, hurt his hand on the job, denied medical treatment, and summarily fired and really evicted from the camp, which was terrible from the beginning. And I think if there's a sign that was held in the plant, the potato shed, it said, "A bruised potato never heals." And you think
Mm.
about the statement of the care for the crop, but
Right.
total disregard for the human being, preparing that
Oh, the
crop.
irony. Wow.
Yeah, so this young boy was cheated out of money, forced to leave the camp, stranded in the middle of nowhere in Bridgehampton. Luckily, made his way or found his way to Riverhead, where Mary Chase Stone and her group called Long Island Volunteers secured his safe passage home. And they actually followed through, contacted the Department of Labor, and was able to get the monies back that was owed to him. And all that was levied was a few fines for some of these camp leaders and whatnot. And it just shows really in a nutshell the tragedy that can happen. And what worries me, if we think contemporary times, there's a lot of suggestions of rolling back child labor laws to fill the void in what is expected of these mass deportations that's going to leave in the agricultural industry. And for me, as a historian and professor of this, really, and also man of labor, it's fearful, because are we really going to use children to make up the gap here, knowing the dangers that exist?
Yeah.
And Mark, like, again, I keep going back to that chapter 3, Esperanza, and all the things that Mark was bringing out. We just spoke about the crew chiefs, but there was an ad you would put in the book, Mark, where there was it spoke of, Esperanza, what they were selling with the Kachag labor camp was idyllic athletic fields, great fishing, schools. I mean, that was the sell.
You mean false propaganda?
Yeah. And the conditions, and Mark, these were the kind of things that really, resonated so deeply with me, how Mark brought out each man would have 40 square feet of room in the housing, if you will. Esperanza, 40 square feet is a pool table. Okay, just to put it in perspective and paint
it's a bed.
It's beyond a bed. Mark talked about 38 men, one working toilet. I mean, so the store,
not to mention, if you wanted to cook, you couldn't. I mean, you
really right.
You were using kerosene heaters or something
which was the cause of some of the fires.
Yeah, exactly.
And Mark, there was the camp store in Kachag that was really, again with the highly inflated prices. There was just no chance. But I do have to say one thing, and Esperanza, after this, I want to move it into the town of Southampton. But just to close on this, now the Wickham farm family, Mark, who, while they had migrant camps, correct me if I'm wrong, and again, Wickham, Esperanza, that's a well-known name. There was Wickham was a supervisor of the town of Southold, if I recall. They were the one farm family. They treated these workers with respect in every way. So we don't want to paint with too broad a brush, but unfortunately, the Wickhams were the exception rather than the rule. Correct, Mark?
Yeah, and I'll tell you, the goal of my book was to get a full picture from all sides, and I reached out to many farmers. Some spoke to me, many didn't. And Tom Wickham was gracious enough to meet with me, took me around his property, and he explained how his father and his father's father, and really the Wickhams, have been farming in the area for generations. And they really cared, for them, it was more about quality than quantity. So they actually had housing on their facility, and still do, for some workers. They've developed strong relationships over time. One of the workers with John Wickham, Tom Wickham's father, was able to save up enough money to buy a home in Cutchogue, which obviously the prices weren't what they are today, but that's an enormous feat. He put his own kids through college. It's just a really successful story to show and really what that eliminated was the crew leader middleman, if you will. And that's why you had that really symbiotic relationship between the farmer and the workers. And it really was a good example of what it was and what it really should have been. But sadly, that was the minority of examples that the history has shown.
Wow.
Yeah, it's not to say that didn't exist in many of the farms. I'm sure, and as you said, Irwin, we're not trying to paint this with the broad stroke of everything was horrible and all farmers are bad, but it's not. But it was just not, in general, the story, it speaks for itself.
Wickham was the anomaly, Esperanza.
Yeah.
Not the unfortunately, right? So I mean,
and I think it does speak, what you were saying, Irwin, earlier. It speaks to the racism that did exist here, despite the fact that people will say, "Oh, there was no racism."
Right.
I mean, we've talked about the segregated Wainscott train station that existed until it was decommissioned, when that was illegal. And we talk, I've heard the stories of the people who lived on the camps in Bridgehampton along the turnpike who weren't allowed. They had to use the back door to the candy kitchen. I recently learned this.
Wow.
I mean, weren't allowed into some of the shops or most of the shops. They were only allowed into certain ones.
Right. And this isn't the Deep South we're talking about, where
And
that
this
kind of
isn't
behavior.
ancient history.
That's correct.
We're
Another,
talking the
well,
60s,
in Esperanza, like
the
in
70s, even.
reading Mark's book, and I'm just going to go through this real quick just to give our audience a little taste, if you will. By 1960, Mark, there were 13 labor camps in the town of Southampton with similar conditions already described. Esperanza, I'm just going to, list these real quick. I mean, AC Carpenter, because the address is even Deerfield Road in Watermill. There was a fire there where 25 people escaped, according to Mark's book. And some of these names you're going to recognize, right? I mean, the Roscoe Labor Camp, ROSKO, Butter Lane in Bridgehampton. The South Shore Produce Labor Camp in Wainscott, Esperanza. The Babinski Labor Camp, Mecox Road in Bridgehampton. H. Saxon Sons, Baldwin Labor Camp, Foster Avenue in Bridgehampton. Jacobs Labor Camp, Foster Avenue, Bridgehampton. Another fire that killed 3 people. So, Mark, the South Fork, well, yeah, there was a lot in the North Fork to talk of. I mean, the South Fork, especially really the Bridgehampton area in particular, Bridgehampton, Lome, Esperanza, but Bridgehampton in particular were really the heart of it in the town of Southampton.
Yeah, and in the back of the book, I have an index which lists ultimately around 100 labor camps, most what the records have shown at the address, general vicinity, the township. And you mentioned the Jacobs labor camp, and that tragic story, that was actually a one-story rundown house. And what Mr. Jacobs did, he was cited many times for many violations at this house or camp, and he just ignored them, didn't do anything about it. So one of the workers were actually they had to nail the door shut to keep out the drafts in the winter. So in 1968, a fire erupted and it killed 3 workers, including Myrtle Lee Grant, a woman who was blind, deaf, and mute. She couldn't escape and get out, and sadly died in terrible conditions. Mr. Jacobs was actually charged in the wake of that fire, but he had surgery and he died from that surgery, and thus the charges were dropped. It may never be known if he would have been the first camp operator to have been charged, but likely would have. But again, because of his passing, that case was dropped and it never proceeded.
You know,
But it just gives an indication of the scope and size and dramatic impacts here.
yeah. Before we're gonna Esperanza, we could talk about this for hours, but we really do want to bring it into present day a little bit because there are parallels I know Esperanza and I talk about, and we're going to bring that up, and then we want to just tell a little bit more about what Mark is doing. But I just want to touch on these two real fast, Mark. I mean, in addition to your work with the book, there was a couple of films, What Harvest for the Reaper, which I know you mentioned in the book, and another quote that really threw me, got me, hurt me, any term you want to use, came from the film The Harvest of Shame in 1960, where this quote, Esperanza, sit down for this one, please. We used to own slaves. Now we just rent them. This was 1960. Okay. Mark, I mean, both
And
of these films are important to this subject matter.
Oh, certainly. And the Harvest of Shame was a wonderful program, but it was more of a national viewing of the camps, and Cutchogue was briefly touched on, as well as Riverhead briefly. But What Harvest for the Reaper was, and it's very hard to locate. I was able to somehow retrieve it, and I use it for my class that I'm teaching in Hofstra. That really gives a perfect picture. And it was inside exclusively at the Cutchogue labor camp. It starts in Arkansas with Andrew Anderson, follows the journey up to Long Island, and it really depicts not only the terrible conditions, but the brutal exploitation economically, and it really paints that vivid picture. And quite frankly, it would have been difficult to write this book without that documentary. It really is that influential in this story, along with, as Esperanza mentioned, the hundreds of newspaper articles, and really no other sources to rely on. It really paints a grand picture. I will commend, back to the newspapers, the reporting of the time was great. And I'll actually quote one reporter, Ruth Shire, in 1950, who stated, "When you crowd people in unsuitable quarters with inadequate facilities, tragedy is bound to strike," and it did. Even the most hostile communities can no longer feel complacent when they contemplate the charred bodies of children who have been trapped in dwellings away from good water pressure. And the fires were rampant. In 1959 alone, there were 8 deaths in 11 days. And I want to take a moment to share the story of a woman named Dilcia Trent, 22-year-old mother of three. Her husband was working in the fields. They were living in a one-room shack in Riverhead, January. She wanted to light this. The room was cold, and the babies are crying, all under the age of 4, and they're on the bed crying. So Miss Trent wanted to light the kerosene heater, this mammoth-sized 80-pound kerosene heater. She dropped the wick of the match on the floor. The rug, which is saturated with kerosene, starts to get on flames. She attempts to roll out the rug and throw it outside, but in doing so, she knocked down the kerosene heater. When she picked it up, she got kerosene all over her body and her clothing, and she actually became inflamed. She was a
Ah,
human torch. So now this woman has a choice between running outside to douse the flames in the mud or try to do something to save her children. She chose the former. She went outside, she doused the flames. Within seconds, the place was engulfed. The 3 children perished. She died 2 weeks later from the fire. I remember in a July doing my research, crawling on my hands and knees in the Riverhead Cemetery, looking for a gravestone, a marker for this young woman, and there was none to be
oh
found.
my gosh.
I found out later that many of the workers were buried in mass graves,
That's
either
graves. Yeah.
there or Hart Island over near the Bronx. So again, a sad travesty, and I do make it a point to name these names because they're forgotten. And that was a really big mission of mine in the book, to name the names of those so that we can remember what happened here.
Yeah, that is so admirable. But
It's chilling,
yeah,
really.
it's just, you
And
know,
one thing you mentioned, the Kutchog labor camp now, and you can find, I think, the documentary "What Harvest for the Reaper" is available on. I see it AmericanArchive.org. I think you can view the whole thing or part of it anyway. But the Kutchog camp, was that the longest lasting one? Is that the one that I'm thinking of,
No,
or
you're probably referring to the one on Depot Lane. Cutchogue
the
Camp
one
was,
on
yeah.
Depot Lane?
Yeah,
Okay,
the
okay.
Cutchogue
So
camp
there's a
was on Cox
difference.
Lane. And in Esperanza, you bring up an interesting point because I was actually able to get the records from New York State of of when the Eastern Suffolk Cooperative was formed. So I have the names of the people, which I didn't share because I didn't think that would really help and only bring controversy and pain. But I know the families and the names of who started that, and they were farmers from Southold, Shelter Island, and so forth. Um, they ran the 2 camps. Essentially, the Cutchogue camp was in operation from 1943 till 1983. Then they dissolved. But the Depot Lane camp, which is a smaller camp, but nonetheless a camp, really went on until around 2003,
oh my
2004
gosh.
Right,
until
exactly.
explosion.
That's why I bring it up,
Yeah.
because people, this is not ancient history,
That's
as Irwin
correct.
likes to say. And it truly is not. I mean, yes, it's 20 years ago now, but it's the 21st century
And
for this to be happening. And let's just, I mean, take it a step further. This stuff continues to happen in some way. It's right under our noses here. You go by in Riverhead in Southampton, you see people living in the woods
that's
in
correct.
makeshift housing, tents, and so forth. This
Yeah.
is not a problem that has left
A
us.
a great philosopher uses the term history is circular, and that's an Esperanza. Mark, she doesn't want to take credit for it, but it's an Esperanza Leon quote. We're giving her credit for it. But history is circular, and yeah, I mean, from the more things change, the more they stay the same. But we really have to start wrapping up. But we really want to just touch on, Mark Torres. This guy's pretty prolific in a lot of ways, Esperanza, and we really should let our audience know. I mean, he's written both fiction and nonfiction books. Uh, Go to marktorresauthor.com. I got that correct, Mark, I think, right? Because
Yes,
there
that's
are,
correct.
because you'll tell, he's already, again, he's labor lawyer, professor at Hofstra University, really telling this story and shares a lot of the stories for those of you who prefer a fictionalized account. Mark, you wrote one book called The Stirring in the North Fork that is a novel, but sort of touches on all of these issues in the book as well.
Yes, well, I used to spend almost annually, go out with the family and spend a week or two in Greenport, back then when it was more affordable. And I first, always interested in history. I've learned of the camps around then, but even then was surprised at the lack of history or of resources to store. But I knew and learned enough to be able to incorporate that, albeit fictional setting of a story, that camp into it. And then I knew I'd revisit it, which I did later in 2021 with this book. Um, Long Island Migrant Labor Camps. And I'll just point out one other thing. That's the subtitle, Dust for Blood, People always
Right.
ask, well, where does that come from? And that actually comes from the What Harvest for the Reaper documentary, where a worker's interviewed, and he explains that, well, we work to the bone, and we get our paychecks, and there's nothing there. And then hence the title Dust for Blood. And typically that would happen on Saturday nights. And the records of this are, and many people I've spoken to remember when they were young, Saturday nights were the trouble nights. That was the nights where workers would be paid,
Right.
shocked, frustrated. All of this would boil over to violence within the camps, outside of the camps. And really, it was a global problem. It wasn't just to the camps itself. The communities had to deal with these issues. The first responders had to deal with these issues. Imagine a sleepy, quiet farming community is dealing with mass fatalities in a fire. The burned, charred bodies coming into the hospitals.
Oh,
They weren't equipped for this, and law enforcement as well. So really a tragic time that's worth remembering.
wow.
Yeah, yeah. And sadly, I mean, I would think that often this would be sort of the blame would have been placed not on the people operating these camps, but on the people occupying the camps, which is even more tragic
Well,
because
blame
they're
the victim.
everybody's part. Yeah, blame the victim.
Blame the victim.
Exactly.
That's right.
Yeah.
And they were, remember, they had no recourse, no laws applicable to them, no implications. And you're right, the public
They're
was right, stay away from the camps.
right. They're non-entities. They're like the untouchables. Yeah, yeah.
Completely true. Well, this was, again, we could go on with this. I could. Matter of fact, after I stop recording this, Esperanza, maybe I'm going to hang out with Mark and talk about this for another 3 or 4 hours, depending on his schedule. But we really want to take this opportunity to thank you, Mark, for telling this story to our Hamptons podcast audience. This is a off the radar story. I mean, he said it himself, Esperanza. I mean, he's written a book. There's a couple of films. More needs to really be learned about this. And I encourage our audience, marktorresauthor.com. This Mark does speaking engagements. He has Zoom presentations in addition to, his body of work as an author. And what he does as a labor lawyer, which is also, intrinsically involved in all this. So
yes, and may I, you do have speaking engagements, and I've attended quite, couple, 2 or 3. Your most recent book, you're currently speaking on your book called, and this is another Long Island history book, Long Island and the Legacy of Eugenics, and this is another fascinating, if very heavy topic, but really you bring it to light, which is what we need to know about these topics. People need to be made aware of them.
Exactly. And that's why we encourage our audience, marktorresauthor.com. Just this guy's doing, Mark, you're doing such important work, and we're grateful to you for it. And we're grateful for you being a guest on our Hamptons podcast. Thank you for being
It was a pleasure.
here.
Thanks for having me, guys. It was a pleasure.
And Esperanza, speaking of a pleasure, it always is.
Thank you, Irwin. Till next time.
Till next time. Thanks so much for joining us. New episodes of Our Hamptons are released every other Tuesday. Find them wherever you get your podcasts.